And good evening, and welcome to TheDustyFeet. So, as you can tell, it's the 9th. Well, you can tell by the date, right? It's not that you can tell anything on the screen, right? It's the 9th, and we're on part 2 of the homework series, To Judge or Not to Judge. There will be 3 parts. This is part 2. There will be a third part. And if we're fortunate, we will have a special guest for that third part. Long-time listener, first-time guest. So that will be exciting. And as always, the webpage is there for you to gather all of the previous episodes, any updates, any new news going on. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. It helps the channel grow, and it helps other people see it. And Twitter is where you're going to get all the latest and greatest news, including reminders that we're on at whatever time we're on, right? Which is every Thursday at 7 o'clock, right? Okay, so tonight, part 2, Tim Mackie's Matthew series, episode 11, To Judge or Not to Judge. Last week, not so uplifting, and this week probably the same. Might be a little different on part 3, but there's some very harsh realities I think we need to look at and to consider. And these are all dishes in the food for thought. How's that? Dishes in the food for thought. So I think we'll enjoy these. It'll be a challenge as always. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so, okay, well that would be wrong, wouldn't it? Nice try there, Orny, but there we go. That should say 2 on it, shouldn't it? Okay. The Mackie episode. I was going to also possibly play a Bible Project clip on the Book of Judges. Again, a related topic. And the link is in the description for last week's clip and this week's in this description below. But we might not get to that because this is the timing of things. We might not get there. However, it's a worthwhile listen, and we still might get to it in part 3. We'll see. But it could be a worthwhile thing to listen. It's always a worthwhile thing to listen to if you're listening to Bible Project things. So, that said, so let's start with part 2 of Mackie's video, episode 11, To Judge or Not to Judge.
And so what does he mean exactly? What does he mean? What does he not mean? And what are the implications for us? And that's what I want us to explore. But this is crucial. What we're talking about is the day-to-day of our relationships with each other. And how is it that we invite people into our lives to point out character flaws and areas where we're making stupid decisions and we need to grow. But the moment you invite someone in to do that, it just gets very complex. So Jesus gives us wisdom. He gives us guidance on how to do that. And it's profound. Probably, like many of Jesus' teachings, are familiar to us, but when you stop and you reflect, you see how much wisdom and brilliance there really is here. So let's first just look at the words that he used. Look at the first line here. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. I'm going to do my thing that I often do, teach you words from a dead ancient language. All right? In the Bible. The Greek word used in Matthew's gospel for judge is a very standard word. It's a lot like our English word judge, but it has a pretty wide range of meaning, just like our English word judge does. It's the word krino. Krino, class? Krino, yes, very simple. So at its base, it just means to decide, to look at two options, two or more, right? You have more than one thing in front of you, and you survey, you evaluate, and you decide this one is whatever, superior, it's the right thing for whatever reason. Chocolate or vanilla? Clearly vanilla. Like where? Clearly vanilla. And I don't know what kind of vanilla you've had. But, so, all right. So that involves that's a decision. It's a decision that I've made based off of experience. I can survey, the evidence on vanilla is far superior, at least certain kinds of vanilla. All right. So you decide. It's just talking about that mental decision. You survey, you distinguish between things, and you say this one. And so what that's connected to then is another way that we use this concept or this word. And in English, if you have a panel of people, and their job is to survey a whole bunch of things like pies, or dancers or singers or whatever, and they make this decision and it's like their official role. What do we call that group of people? We call them judges. Now we know, that this is not somebody who went to law school or something like that. It's just someone who's being called they have expertise or not, whatever they have, but they're being called on to survey many pies or dancers or whatever, and then they all agree and say it's, this one's the best or whatever. So it's judge. And then, of course, you can get someone who's educated in the field of law and justice and interpretation of law and so on, and then that's their job to have very complex decisions brought to them about people's decisions and behaviors in criminal cases or whatever, and then they make decisions. They offer a judgment. In our country, it's illegal to operate a motor vehicle if you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs, because we say it impairs your judgment, right? So many of us, when we hear the word judge or judgment, we think of something negative. What we think of is superiority complex, something like that. And we'll talk about that in a second. But that's not actually the way we use this word in other cases. It's just a simple word describing multiple options. I choose one. I think this is the best. I'm going to go with this one. Is what Jesus saying here, don't judge, is Jesus saying, ditch your moral compass, don't use any, critical thinking in significant moral decisions in your life? Is that what he's saying? Clearly not, right? That's absurd. That's absurd. If you just read chapters 5 and 6, is there any way that you can deal with anger and lust and truthfulness and integrity and know how to love your neighbor if you aren't growing in your abilities to do this? Right? Becoming a disciple of Jesus means growing in your ability to make moral judgments and to discern between what is good and what is wrong, and then even between what is good and what is best. That requires a judgment, and Jesus expects us to grow in that. But it's clear he's getting at a certain kind of judgment or a certain way of doing this. And because look at verse 2. He's talking about a way that you judge, because he says, in the same way that you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So apparently there are some ways that you could make a decision and have a conviction that someone is doing something and you think it's wrong. You make a judgment, you think it's right, you think their behavior is wrong. There's a way to do that in which that's fair, and you can have that judgment. And if somebody judged you with that kind of way, you would say, yeah, that's fair. Okay, that's cool. But then there are other ways that you can do this to someone, and if it was done to you, you would be no, that's not what I meant. That's not, you're making assumptions, you're filling in gaps, you're assuming motives to me that I don't actually have. Have you guys ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever had people make assumptions about your character based off of something that you did, and you didn't mean that, but that's how people perceived? You guys know what I'm talking about here. And it's lame when people misunderstand you and attribute ill motives to you. That's what Jesus is talking about here. And I think to really clarify what Jesus means when he says don't judge, we have a helpful commentary within the New Testament itself. And that commentary is called the letter of James, which most likely, there's some disagreement, but most likely was written by Jesus' brother, James. It's the James that's in the New Testament. And 75% of what the letter of James is it's James reflecting on the Sermon on the Mount and thinking about how it applies to yet another generation of Christians after him. And James actually, I think, alludes to and explains and clarifies what Jesus means here in James chapter 4. I'll just throw it up here on the screen. James says, "Brothers and sisters, don't slander one another. Anyone who speaks against a brother or sister or judges them speaks against God's law and judges it. There is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who's able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor?" Now notice, again, what James is saying and what he's not saying. He's not saying anything about this other person and whether what they're doing is right or whether it's wrong. That's actually irrelevant, right? They may be doing something that is wrong. That's not the point. The point is how you perceive that and then what you do in response to that. That's his focus here. And notice when he uses the word judge, he uses the same exact word that Jesus uses, but then he uses all these other words to clarify what Jesus is getting at here. And did you pick him up there? What else? What kind of behavior is he talking about here? You're judging them. What are you also doing? You're slandering, or you're speaking against. So he's talking about you observe someone's behavior, and you make a judgment about it. You make a moral judgment about their behavior, but then you do something more. You begin to fill in assumptions about why they're doing that. You have assumptions about their character, and you begin to categorize them as like this kind of person that does that. And then you go even a step further because you advertise what you think about this person, right? You're talking poorly about them. You look down on them, and when you talk about them, there's this slant that could be, it could be described as slander or speaking against them. And then there's even a step further, as Christians, is that we assume that God agrees with us about this person. So, and just really, we would never think of ourselves as doing this, but really, we observe people and what they're doing, we observe their behavior, and then in our minds, there's some extra step that we take, and then we think we know them, and we think we know why they're doing that behavior or whatever. And then we imagine Jesus standing next to us, and we're like, Jesus, that guy. And we actually think Jesus is standing there going, I know, they're so lame, you're so right about that person. We do, you guys, we do. There's some sense of like moral uprightness and like I understand how Jesus feels about everybody, and then we treat people accordingly. Don't act like you don't do this. Even if it's just totally internally, we all do this to people, especially to other Christians. And James is just like, there's so many things wrong with that. First of all, it's not our role. When I do that, I'm assuming a posture towards that other person that is it's totally inappropriate. I'm assuming the posture of God, that somehow it's me and Jesus over against this person. And it's a posture of distance, right? It's a posture that it's about me and Jesus, and then it's them, and there's this line, and that line is like, I know how Jesus thinks that person ought to behave, and I might even think of myself as God's appointed committee to help make that known to them, And it's this posture of distance. And what James is saying right here clearly is just like, this posture fills us with delusions about our own character, and it's not reality. In reality, when I'm in this scenario right here, and the reality is I'm on the wrong side of that line, because this is not reality. What's reality is that I'm over here. I'm over here with this person, and we're looking at Jesus look at us. This is reality. It's putting ourselves in the posture of God. And what this person may be doing is right, it may be wrong, that's irrelevant. what James is focusing on is the inappropriateness of me and Jesus against this person. And that's exactly what Jesus moves towards in this famous parable here. And he gives us wisdom for how to make sure we're not assuming this posture. And it's the brilliance of Jesus. He does it in a way that gets you to laugh as he punches you in the gut at the same time, right? So it's a famous image. Verse 3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye? Pay no attention to the plank in your own eye. Now, when he says brother, you can fill in, it's a gender-neutral term for another disciple in the community of disciples. And so in some translations, they translate it brother or sister. So why do you look in another disciple's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? So he's going for the laugh here. He's totally going for the laugh. So he's talking about this little tiny speck, which many of us often get, or whatever, in your eye. Happens to me when I ride my bike everywhere. And the worst is like in summer, and there's not that many bugs in Portland, but to get the bug in your eye, it's lame when that happens, and it really hurts. So he's talking about the little thing in your eye, and then he paints this utterly ridiculous picture of a beam, like a telephone pole. You know what I mean? That's the image he wants you to conjure up in your head here. The whole point is that it's as big as your head, and you imagine it in your eye. It's ridiculous. You're supposed to laugh, right? And so he clearly gets you on his side to just see here's reality. And it's a brilliant image that has a number of implications. I just think it's worth a cup of tea to just sit and think about all of the different implications of this metaphor that Jesus uses. So his whole point is that this is a posture of delusion. It's inappropriate. That's not the reality. And if I'm going to move towards another disciple, notice, does the other disciple actually have a speck in their eye? Does he say it's just a figment of your imagination? Is it there in their eye? Yes, yeah, totally. So he's saying they've got an issue, character flaw. They're doing something stupid or selfish. That's really happening. But before you even think about addressing it or bringing it up, you need to have done a whole bunch of work or get yourself in some kind of mindset so that encounter becomes healing and helpful and not destructive and counterproductive. And it's all packed into this metaphor here. So the first implication, I think, of having a huge log, it's great, a huge telephone pole in your eye, is with what part of your body do you perceive this other person's speck in their eye? With what part of your body do you use to look at their speck? You're using eye. Where is the beam? It's in your eye. This is intentional on Jesus' part. What does that mean? What it means is that if I'm a disciple, I'm seeing someone else and their behavior, and I decide or I make a judgment I think that's destructive. I think that's against the teachings of Jesus, that's not going to go well for themselves or the other. The first thing Jesus wants us to assume is that your vision is impaired. You've got your own issues, you've got your own sin and stuff going on, and what that affects, first and foremost, is your ability to see. And so this is very interesting. He says, assume, first off, that your own vision is impaired. In which case, you need to evaluate yourself. Am I actually seeing correctly? I need to assume that I don't have the whole story. I can just see someone's behavior, right? We all walk around bumping into each other, and we're watching what each other says and does. But human beings are extremely complex, right? And our motives are deep motives and rationale for why we do and say the things that we do. It's extremely complex. It's very complex. And what Jesus is saying is, first of all, just assume that you don't have 100% vision of why and what this is all about. Assume that you don't actually know all of their motives. Assume that you don't know their story and what's behind it. It doesn't mean that their behavior is all of a sudden right. It might actually be wrong. But just assume that you don't know the whole complex sea of factors that go into why this person is behaving the way that they're behaving. How can he not imply that by saying that you see a speck through a huge beam? How do you know you're not actually just looking at one of the tree rings, of the beam that's in your eye? How do you don't know? You need to do serious reflection. That seems to me as the first implication. And then the second implication, I think, really takes us to the heart of the gospel and the heart of the message of the kingdom. And it's that I assume that I can't see everything clearly about this person, and that humbles me. That gives me a perspective to be more careful and hesitant about how I approach this person. And then the second, of course, is they actually have a speck. Let's say they do actually have a speck. I should just always assume that my own sin and pride and self-worth issues and insecurity, you should just assume that my own issues and sin are more serious and more grievous than the person that I'm noticing or that I'm observing, right? We have this tendency to combine arrogance towards others and ignorance towards ourselves, right? To exonerate ourselves because we know kind of our motives for doing things, right? Kind of, right? We kind of have self-awareness and understanding of why we do the things that we do. We have none of the other person, or maybe a little bit. And so Jesus says, just assume that you've got your own issues that are just way more serious. And he's not encouraging us, I don't think, to just self-loathing, right? Or self-hatred. I think he's pushing us to do what all disciples of Jesus should do. And it's taking on this commitment to self-reflection, to honest self-evaluation. And instead of assuming that we're in a position, I think our proper English word to describe what James is describing, what Jesus is saying, is about condemning. It's about assuming that we know what this person is about and why they do the things that they do. And Jesus is saying, just assume that this is an inappropriate posture for you, and assume that you've got issues to deal with that are way more serious than this other person. Which doesn't mean that you never have the conversation. What it means is that it forces you to go into the heart of the gospel yourself and walk away changed from that experience. Because if reality is not me and Jesus, and then this person with a line between us, it means that the reality is this, like I'm on this side of the line, and Jesus is there. And how do I, before Jesus, deal with this log, right? This telephone pole that's in my eye? How on earth do I get this thing out of my head, right? It's heavier than my whole body. Like, how do I get it out? How do I get it out of there? And Jesus just assumes, in the light of all of his teachings and in everything that's about to happen, that we know what that entails. Like, how do you do this? And it's very simple. It takes you to the heart of the gospel. That I come to Jesus. I'm not over here. I'm here before Jesus. And I'm a disciple of Jesus with a whole community of people. And by definition, to become a disciple of Jesus means acknowledging something about myself. It means making a confession and an acknowledgement. I am a kind of person who's in desperate need of God's grace that comes to me through Jesus. I have serious issues. I've got a stinking telephone pole in my eye, I have serious issues. And I come before Jesus, and I listen to him talk, and I read the stories about how he treats people who have telephone poles in their eyes. And I look at how he lived his life for me, and he died for me, and he was raised for me, and by his Spirit, he's present and real for me. And this is precisely what Jesus does not do to me. I mean, Jesus is actually the only one qualified to do this. And this is exactly what Jesus does not do to you or to me. And it's that experience of being a disciple of Jesus and coming to that realization that, like, Jesus doesn't condemn me for this massive issue that I have that just compromises my motives, it compromises my sight and my ability to even see other people for who they really are. He doesn't condemn me. He loves me, and he gave his life, he gave his death, and he gives his resurrection life.
For us. Okay. Okay, there's a lot to digest in there. Like I said, get your cup of tea, and we can start chatting. Okay, so let's. And it's interesting because you like sometimes you want to talk about the end at the beginning, but let's go back to the beginning to get us to the end. Is that fair? Okay, so chronos to me krenos kreno to decide. Okay, so. And that's the basis of the word. I like that, and I like we do the same thing with Hebrew, and sometimes you need to do the same thing. Not sometimes we do the same thing with Greek as well. Is that we then stretch it to say what this deal when it's decide. Even a judge decides. Okay, so to decide. Okay, and we have our decide. We call it deciding is making a choice. Okay, but let's use decide, choice. Let's kind of play with this. So we are supposed to make our own choices. We're supposed to decide for ourselves. Okay. Does it say in Scripture that we're supposed to decide for others? That I'm supposed to make your decisions for you? Okay. I can recommend. Moses said, "Here's your choices." And he said, choose life. Okay? But he can't make it for you. He couldn't make it for them. They had to make the choice themselves. God is no different in that scenario. The choices are there. We decide. Are we supposed to decide for somebody else? Okay? And are we so bold as to not let them make that choice? So that's one. And then, two, should they be doing our choices? I come up with a choice, and I go, well, obviously this is the right choice. This is the right choice. This is what you should be doing, obviously. So, and then you're not doing it, so I need to tell you you're not doing the right choice or the right thing. Okay? Or are we supposed to live and be accountable for our own choices? I'm supposed to live and be accountable for my choice. And in that life and choices, I might be an example to others, maybe. And in that, when they see a choice and they go, well, that's a choice too, what are the choices? Or I guess the real perspective review is, are we addressing making decisions and then making a determination of what other people's decisions should be? I'm going to decide what your decision should be. And then either you don't agree or we haven't had a chance to talk or at the deal. So now I'm going to spread that criticism to others. Okay, I'm going to spread that criticism to others. Now I can do it a multitude of ways. God's the one that sees the heart part. This is interesting because you can spread it directly, meaning Bobby said this and you spread it out, right? Or did this, right? So now I'm spreading that to other people. Again, that's so counter-biblical, isn't even funny. Or two, that we do it anonymously. I have a friend that, and you blah, 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 blah out. Okay? So you think, well, because I didn't mention their name, I'm not really guilty of that. And I go, that's interesting because everything that we've seen, that we've been reading so far in Matthew, has pushed that heart of the matter issue strongly in, are we supposed to make decisions and then spreading that criticism towards others? And we're going to get into that criticism part. And then when we go and spread it, and then we go even worse yet, we take it and we spread it to those in the community, in our church, in our group, in our circles. And then we spread it outside the community. Facebook, for instance. Put a Facebook post. Now it's guaranteed outside the community. Okay? Because what'll happen is, say you put it in a small group, in a private group on Facebook. where somebody else is going to take it. And you go, well, I'm not responsible for that. No, you're not responsible for their behavior. You are responsible for your choice and your decision. And that's a poser that we really need to think about, and the culpability we have in that, and the consequences that fall from that. So let's go over this again. This is it. Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly take the speck out of your brother's eye. Okay? When we get to this point, we see how you judge others will be how you are judged. Okay? This is the point, right? It says that's how you are judged. What the measure you give out will be how it will be measured to you. I want to ask an uncomfortable question. And we gloss over this because we have this churchianity thought of that we're not accountable for anything, that God's grace has granted us life beyond, but we think that there's zero accountability for anything, that there won't be any reckoning still to deal with, and how God's going to do that. But when you read that, take a step back. Is he addressing how others will judge you? Is that what he's saying? Because read it. Just sit back and read it. And then tell me, is it how God's going to hand out that to you? Or there? Is this a live by the sword, die by the sword statement? Is this a... So chew on that a little bit. Because I think you have a bias. I think we have bias when we read a lot of things. And I think like that log in our eye, speck in your scenario, that we have biases we don't even realize. And when we sit back and listen and read it, can it say, that's interesting. I haven't seen it that way before. Who's judging whom? That's what I wrote. We want the freedom to make decisions for ourselves. We want the freedom to make decisions for others, but we don't want to open ourselves up. We don't open ourselves up to the same decision, accepting that process. How critical. How hypocritical can it get? Seriously. We want to be able to have that to somebody, but we're not willing to take it ourselves. We're not willing to do that. When somebody comes to us and has something they do, we're all of a sudden up in arms. Oh, obviously you must be wrong. These are hard pills to swallow. I know for me it is, especially. I'm speaking to myself. It's hard. And it has taken, in the last 5 years, it has taken dedicated effort to stop, to listen, to reflect, to work more on the logs in my own eye, because I want to see more. I really do. I want to see more. And, we do this in life. We don't even realize we're doing it. We don't even realize when we make these decisions and looking at people and making these things and making these judgments, these snap judgments, and these they should be doing this and they should be doing that. And oh my gosh, don't they see this? We do this all the time. We do this all the time. It's so part of our culture. It's so part of what's ingrained in us that I could spend the rest of my life doing nothing but trying to strip that out, and I'd be busy. He mentions the letter James is 75% of it is like commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and I'd say, yeah, I'm not disagreeing with Mackie on this. It's more about a point. There's a couple of things. One is the target audience that James is talking to. Okay, we mentioned this many times on Dusty Feet, that context is the point. I need to know when the original people lived, where they were, what they were doing. Those kind of things. What would have affected their decision processes? What would have influenced decisions and choices? Okay, and specifically, if it's written to somebody. We make the assumption that the Bible is to us, and it's not to us. We've said this multiple times. It's for us. So we get to the benefit of opening somebody else's mail. Maybe not in Torah, maybe not in the Hebrew Scriptures, maybe not in the Gospels. Definitely, the vast majority past there, except for maybe Revelation, is opening somebody else's mail. Okay? It's to someone else. Paul's are specific. They're to the communities in Corinth, Colossia, Galatia, Ephesus. Okay? We call it the letter to the Ephesians, the Galatians, the Corinthians, right? Actually, the titles they're the letters to the community in so-and-so. Okay? To the community in so-and-so. It's not even church, because they're not. They are communities. That the word church doesn't exist till hundreds of years later, right? It's an inserted word that overwraps the community side, because when you get into community, it got intermingled with synagogue in Greek in that setup, and they were trying to strip the Semitic fingerprints on that. So they made it church, okay? Just like Jesus Christ versus Yeshua HaMashiach, okay? Yeshua the Messiah. Christ has nothing to do with Messiah. It's a word inserted to strip, okay? So we just need to remember that in the context. So we remember that James, and he tells you in the beginning who he's writing to. That's what I love. So I read in the top of a letter, look at the top. To Bob. Okay, that's mine. So if it's on the counter and it's to Bob, then it's to me. It's not to you. It's to me. Okay, if there's a letter to Heather somewhere, then it's to Heather. It's the address, the labels, and it's for Heather. So Heather can read it. If she shares it, that's her choice. But it's not mine to go, hey, what's your little letter say? It's to her. Okay? So James is writing to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. Okay? So he's writing to, basically, the outward-facing target audience that Yeshua is speaking to in the land. He's talking to those people in the land. And then James is echoing this out. Time-wise, we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, for instance. The Gospel of Matthew and James came out. James could have come out before Matthew. Okay, James could have come out before Matthew. But remember, James is not commenting on Matthew. James is commenting on the stories of the teachings of Jesus, of Yeshua, and those have been passed. Those have been spread. Those stories have been told. They didn't have tapes, didn't have CDs, didn't have the stuff. They went and repeated the stories from people that were there, and then it got further along where it was like, I was with a guy that told me about a guy that was there with Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. And he tells the story. Okay? And as that story goes out, I believe back then, I honestly do, that there was more accuracy in passing those stories. It wasn't quite as monkey as we do now, that deal where you pass the deal, sit around in a circle and do that stuff. It's because I think it's something we've lost. I think we've lost the art of storytelling. We've lost the art of gathering and passing on information. That's lost in our minds, doing it and spitting it out. So now we write books, we do this. And this has been happening over the last 1,000 years, okay? Maybe more, 1,500 years. And so there have been more of written things down and those kind of deals to pass on and go to where now people, you don't need paper anymore. You have everything soft, right? And how this goes. I think that those stories echoed out and ran out. And then James is just talking and clarifying it, which I think is cool. Now we have context to James, right? We have a feeling for where James is and what's going on. So James is addressing a group who had mostly heard the teachings of Jesus when James is giving his thoughts on the story. Remember, this is the time the story is still being shared. James, chapter 4, 11 and 12. Do not speak against one another, brothers. He that speaks against a brother and is judging a brother, he speaks against the law and judges. He speaks against law and judges law. But if you judge law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. One is the lawgiver, who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? Okay. So, it says, and do not grumble against one another, brothers. Hold on. Okay, so that's that. So in that, James follows this. There's another verse in chapter 5 where he actually mentions it again, and he brings it up. He says, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Okay. So obviously, none of this is your job, right? None of this is your job in this. Judging the law, okay? I'm going to use the word. He's probably going to make it comfortable. It's Torah, okay? Because that was their law, okay? So he's going, if you speak against it, you're speaking against the law, and you're speaking against all, you're judging the law. You might not want to do that. And I think the statement, again, if we go back to decide, is the way I'm telling you to do the law is the way you need to do it. Why not just do it? Can you just do can you live in God's community under God's guidance? See, we think about this law. We think that it's this harsh little deal. It's a community. Read them. They're all good things that keep you safe. There is not a single thing in there that you can't do. Not a single one. That said, that meaning that as a community group, right? Obviously, women's menstrual stuff I have nothing to do with. Priestly duties I have nothing to do with. So those are things I can't do because that's not my job, right? But the men's stuff, yes. The women's stuff, for women, right? And those kind of deals. But there's nothing in there that you go, that's impossible. There's stuff that says you can't. It gives a location, like it says you have to do this here, and so if you got to be there, you can't really do it if you're not there. Again, we've talked about this many times, and he brings it up there. Now, in that, we say, okay, is James, remember, we've said this a lot, with Jesus, when he's talking, when he mentions something, it takes them back to the Hebrew scriptures. It takes them back there to that stuff. And that's important that it takes them back there, okay? And so you have to think that Jewish community, that Hebrew community, what are they going to bring about when James starts talking about, and he goes, there is one lawgiver, okay? So let's go back to Isaiah 33:22, okay? Isaiah 33:22. It says, for the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. He will save us. That's pretty good context. And that's what James is refreshing their minds about when he gets this. They should be flashing back to that. We should be flashing back to that. If we don't do that, again, we're the one missing it because we picked up somebody else's mail. How many crime stories have you watched? A crime movie do that, and they pick up some letter, and it's not till later on where all of a sudden they realize something in that means something not that they thought. They picked up something, that note, and it said something, and all of a sudden they realize it means this. Now you have context, now you have the piece, now you understand. Okay? And I think a lot of that when we read Paul, when we get confused with Paul, we get confused with Peter, because we're not looking at the context of the audience that he's talking to and what they would be understanding. And here with James, it's the same piece. When he mentions in James 5:9, where he says, so that you may not be judged, behold, the judge is standing at the door. Okay. 1 Corinthians, again, maybe he's talking about Paul's letters to them, but there is a reference to here in this piece. And it says, therefore, do not pronounce judgment before time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive his commendation from God. Okay. Now we get commendation, and there's people that take automatically commendation in today's world. That's they're getting an award. I've got a rack of them. When I was in the military, I got a big chest full of them. And yet, this is Old English, King James, commendation. They've drugged this out through because it's very convenient. And yet there, it had more of a feudal context. Go look up feudal, okay? It has a feudal context. And the feudal context is the placing of one's self or one's land under the protection of a lord, so that as to become his vassal. To give all that I am and all that I have to the protection of my Lord, and become his vassal, become his servant, become his tool to be used. That's another way to read it. Something to chew on. And then in the other one where it says, who are you to judge another? Romans. The letter to the Romans, a different group of people and a different target audience, but an interesting comment nonetheless. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls. He will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Okay. So I'm judging you because you don't follow my God. This says that's not your job to judge a servant of another. That's and they're going to bear their consequence for following that. You are going to bear consequence for who you choose to serve, who you choose to follow. Interesting. Again, I still believe they're disparaging a number percentage that think that there's no consequence to what we do. And there's nothing in Scripture that even leads us near to that. It's a doctrine. It's a nice story, but the story doesn't match Scripture that constantly talks about the consequences of our actions and how that plays out and why we have endurance and why some things will happen, because we might personally make a choice and somebody else will take offense to it. And I can't stop that. I can't. I can stand up for what I do. I don't have to condemn you. That's not the choice. That's your choice. If you don't like that I've made this choice, then that's okay. And sometimes that's going to rub feathers the wrong way. We've seen that in those choices that are made. The Maccabees, we're in this season with Hanukkah. And of course, we have the story of the Maccabees. So again, if you don't know your Hanukkah story, go look up that one. I think you'll see some interesting choices made there. Okay? Choices. James is not addressing the reality of other people. They're not the point. It is us as followers and how we treat others. And this context is clearly talking about other believers, and how they are living and conducting themselves. Meaning, all of this, what Jesus is talking about, what James is talking about, okay, is how we get along in our community, how we treat others in our community. There is nothing about us and to put it in that vernacular, and then complaining about the Romans, meaning and condemning Rome for being Romans, okay? And he's going, that's God's. Outside the nations, that's always been God's. That was God's issue in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures. It hasn't changed. That's still God's. That's God's to handle. We have our own communities, our own people, sphere of influence that we have, and we're responsible for ourselves. And how we are responsible to God for those. And then how we interact in our community with us. That, again, sandwich board guy that's busy screaming and hollering condemnation and damnation and hell, and they've turned God into an escape, a fire escape pass. You've turned God into say this little thing, and you get a get out of jail free card. This is what we've turned salvation into. Doesn't match the story, but it sure is popular. I think it's becoming less popular, actually, if you want to know the truth. I think that is becoming less and less popular. And I honestly believe less and less of an impact. I think the turn and burn doctrinal push that worked for a long time doesn't work anymore. For a lot of reasons. Good and bad, mind you. Both sides. Good and bad. We want to fill in these people's character. I want to villainize them when they do this. I want to deride their character if they're making choices that are not our choices. I won't even say bad choices. Say choices that aren't our choices. We, deride them, character, whatever we need to do to do that. The scariest part, and Tim mentions this, I love the phrase, and we assume that God agrees with us. Obviously, God agrees with me. I'm on that part. Then we rationalize by tearing ourselves in others. I'm not doing this or that, and they are doing, and they are so in need. They are in so need of my opinion. You so need to hear what I have to say. I need to tell you this. Oh my gosh, on how many people we have to come up. I need to tell you this. You can live your life and help show me things. I love that. I do. We think we know people because we've heard something or we've seen something, but we know so little, it's scary. If we're really honest with ourselves, we're not really interested in being that open or vulnerable with others. To even start to discuss why we do what problem we have with their own behavior. What I'm saying is, are we willing to call them to our table? And I mean literally, because Jesus did it. I don't know why that's a problem. Are you really willing, if you have a problem with somebody, can you say, hey, Let's go get something to eat. Let's get a cup of tea, cup of coffee. Let's talk. Let's first get to know what's going on before you're so bent on giving your opinion. Can I stop and say, hey, I'd like to know more about you? I have a wonderful friend of mine, Todd, and he's very hard on himself, and I feel for him, okay? But part of me has been very intentional to try to get to know Todd, to try to understand, to get more to get out and understand those. And when you do, it's amazing what you'll find out. And Todd, if you listen, I'd like to get to know more, okay? In those fun parts, we get a chance to really look and really want to know the character. And are we willing to go? Now, here's the point that gets this way, is that we want people to share their deep, dark secrets, okay? We want to play the psychiatrist or psychologist, and we want to share, tell me your deep, dark secrets, and I'll help you unburden yourself and get this off. We don't want to do that to them. We don't want to take this, and I want you to be brutally honest with me so that you can do this. But are we willing to do the same? We're so hypocritical. Oh my gosh. We, as a group, are walking hypocrites, and we assume God's on our side. Mackie draws a really great picture where he says that we assume we're standing on the side of the line. We have Yeshua is over here, he's over here, and we're standing over with him, and we're looking at the other people going, well, obviously, God, you can see that, right? And you realize, you know what? I'm on this side. I'm on this side, which means I'm with them. We've said this before. We are them, they are us. So anytime you hear me say them, like parentheses, just put me after it, right? There's me. Okay? You, us. Us. Because not just me separately, but us as a community, us as a group, us as a body that wants to represent the king. The analogy he gives, a bride for the king. Okay? And are we being that? Can we even do that? If you did, let's say, okay, so you want people to share stuff, and you want to share, and you get this kind of stuff. Okay, we're so willing to share gossip and gospel and yada 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 and all this stuff to people, right? So we bounce it back and forth, and we go, if you had a friend that told you those secrets, and they told you something that you realized in this that you were taunting somebody else about, so you go and you share that out with somebody else. How long do you think that relationship's going to last? How long do you think it's going to go when you have people in that relationship and they and you start talking about them to somebody else? How long do you think that relationship will last? If you're willing to be honest and open about yourself, which was when we talk about repentance and talking, and we're going to get into that in part 3. As a matter of fact, we're going to get into that in part 3. Where we talk about those kind of things a little bit. If we're willing to be that honest, open with ourselves, then maybe somebody will say, I think I can share my stuff with you with that. I would like to have Wilby Wilson back on to talk about this as well in that, where it's a point where you realize you can be comfortable in that, to be able to share that, to be able to embrace that, okay? It's not our role. It's not our part of the kingdom. It's not how we're to tell others about the kingdom. Share the kingdom, live the kingdom. Judging, deciding for others. I want to use that phrase. Deciding for others, inappropriate. Wrong side. That the posture is there as what do you say? Oh, delusional about our own character and severely misrepresents the character of God, the one who we're supposed to represent. We actually, we as believers, do God's character the most damage. God is perfectly capable of defending himself and intervening where he has to. But he leaves it to us to represent him. But that character, it can be the worst character representatives to God, because the way we act and judge and impose decisions, obviously God's on my side when I'm saying this about that, rather than just living your side and showing people this is another decision, another option that you can have on following this God. Misrepresentation. I don't know if I was going to say this or not. I think I will as we wrap this up a little bit. U2 has a song called Pride. And inside it, they're singing about Martin Luther King. Okay? And there's the line where he says, at the end, they took your life, but they could not take your pride. In the name of love, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And you go, if you were to ask Martin Luther King, do you think what they're saying is accurate? Because I don't think Martin Luther King would give a rat's about his pride. Martin Luther King was a humble man. Pride was not in his step. Peter, Paul, looking back, and we name buildings, cathedrals, groups, churches, wantonly throw their names around. Obviously, Paul would be happy with mine. I'm going to put his name on my so-and-so. Peter so-and-so, Mark so-and-so, St. James, blah, 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 whatever. And they're asking, you don't get it, do you? That's not what they're after. That's not who they are. It's almost taking the point to misrepresent the character. The decisions we make. Now, God gets to look at our hearts. He will. And sometimes with our kids, they'll make a choice, and as we're trying to guide them to be able to make decisions on their own when they get there, and we do things and it hurts. But then we can say, I can see why you thought that. I can see it. Sometimes, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me. And you realize, how am I going to change? We have our own issues. Are we willing to bring people into our lives that we are then willing to share as much as we can or dare about ourselves, and then be willing to ask them to really look and see and help me remove my log? And not to get to the point to judge others, but rather to maybe see more clearly that I need to see each brother differently, to see them as the King views us, as the King views me. Can I see them in that light? Can I not decide that my choices should be their choices? But can I love them Not abandon them. Actually, have them at the table. My goal in my new home will be to have more people at my table. More people than I've ever had before. We close next week this time. This time next week, I will have closed on my home. It's a long story. Whether it's the right choice or not, it's another story. But I will have closed on my home by then. And I want to have more people at my table. To some, it'll look like, I don't know, maybe it'll look like, how can you have them at your table? And then I hope, maybe, that our king will say, nice banquet. Nice banquet. Interesting. And then we'll talk about it later. That'll be fun. So next week, we hope to have if not next week, the week after, we hope to have a special guest, long-time listener, first-time caller. Okay? And it'll be fun, and we'll continue. That'll be the part 3 guest. Okay, so if we don't do part 3 next week, then we'll eventually get to it if we don't get to it next week. But then part 3, we'll wrap it up. Tomorrow, the next week will be hopefully a little more uplifting, maybe. There's always hope on the end. I love Yeshua's stories. I love these things because there's always so much more to it. And an interesting point to ponder. Was good. This one it's just caught me. I don't know why it just caught me, this one, but go among the people. Don't assume you know what church looks like. Alan Hirsch. Go among the people. Don't assume you know what church looks like. And thanks for being with us tonight on The Dusty Feet.